Hello and welcome to this video on dry hopping with hops. Dry hopping is when you add hops into your fermentation, either when the fermentation is over, or at least after the primary fermentation is just about done. The first consideration when we talk about dry hopping is what hops you're going to be using, that is the variety. When we talk about dry hopping, you're primarily going to be considering the use of aroma hops. These are going to have either a strong aroma or a strong flavor compound in them with relatively low alpha acid levels, generally less than 6%. That's because you're going to be extracting very few of the alpha acids anyway, as they generally come out and get polymerized during the cooking stage or the boiling stage. Secondary to that is that if you were to add them during the boiling stage, you would lose a lot of these aromas and flavors due to the heat being made. As a result, you're going to be looking at, say, something like a Cascade, a Golding, a Saz, or something similar. All of these are going to have very strong aromas to them. Note, though, that these are primarily North American strains of hops or varieties of hops, rather than European varieties, although again, as always, exceptions will apply. The idea with this is to primarily add more flavor and aromatics to the beer. That's why you don't add them when it's hot. You add them when it's sitting between 18 and 22 degrees, so basically the ideal temperature for yeast to work. This means you keep more flavor and aroma in the beer without really disrupting the flavor. If you were to add them when it's boiling, you either destroy these or, in the best case scenario, you will basically boil them off and they will dissipate into the air. This will of course make the process of boiling your beer incredibly pleasant, but it will also mean that your beer will lack flavor and complexity down the track. This is also why most beers that you're going to be dry hopping will be American or North American style, and that's simply a reality of the type of hops you are using and the circumstances in which they are most suitable. Some craft beers will be using them for not American style beer, and so long as you're not trying to brew Bud Light or Budweiser, nobody's going to complain. Although if you were to serve someone Budweiser or Bud Light or something similar, you're sending them a message that they're not welcome. We mentioned that you're going to be adding it either at the end or towards the end of your primary fermentation, and that's a very vague set of guidelines to work on. But it's important that you get the timing right. If you don't have the timing right, you're either going to have the hops there for too long or too little time. Too long and you will lose the flavor. Too short and you're not going to be imbuing your beer with the desired flavor. The general guideline is going to be sometime around day 4, maybe day 5 of your fermentation. This should be about halfway through the fermentation process. If you're after a more predictable or at least quantifiable timeline, you can try and work to within 3 or 4 points within specific gravity of your final desired product. And that should give you some idea if you're taking regular measurements. Less specifically, if you're not inclined to be that specific, is the end of your fermentation. Somewhere within the last few days should be right. Just be sure that your beer is cool, as mentioned, somewhere between 18 and 22 degrees Celsius. Your choice of hops for this is not going to matter significantly in terms of the final outcome itself, although different formats will have their strengths and weaknesses. With whole cones or whole hops, you're going to have a few more challenges simply because they tend to be quite large. And this means getting them into the fermentation is going to be somewhat more challenging if you're trying to work through a narrow opening and you're not opening the fermenter up completely. It's also going to add a certain amount of the plant matter or vegetable type flavor to your beer. This is, however, the traditional method, so if you're either going to try and go low tech or traditional, this is exactly the approach you want. And honestly, it's not necessarily a bad method, it just has that weakness of producing more of a definitely plant-based flavor to it. But it is also more along the lines of a pure or traditionalist beer. Then you have pallet hops. Pallet hops tend to be the more frequently used commercial option, largely because they're cheap, they're easy to work with, and they tend to be fairly predictable and reliable. They're pretty much dried hops, crushed and then compressed into a pallet. Very simple, very efficient. You add roughly the equivalent strength of hops, but you don't need to work with anywhere near as much volume, so you're not going to have to worry about your fermenter overflowing or similar when you add the hops and they begin to react. You also have more surface area in the end for the hops, in this case pellets, to react and release the oils or similar. There's also a less frequently used option in the form of cryo, and this is basically frozen whole hops. The use of this is that, well, they're available year-round because they are frozen, but they do have many of the same problems, let's say, as using whole hops. That is that you tend to get more of that vegetable-type flavor. The advantages are, though, that the lupulin glands aren't going to be damaged in any way, shape, or form, and this means you will generally get a brighter, cleaner beer as a result. Each of these will have their strengths and weaknesses, and it's up to you to decide which of those you're happy with. And next is how you add the hops to the beer itself. As we mentioned, if you want to be very simple and very low tech, you can simply shove a whole bunch of them through a small opening on the top of the fermenter, or at least by weight a whole bunch, and that will give you the result you're after. If that doesn't really suit you, as you then have to worry about removing them, filtering them out and so on, which is more hassle, you can try and put them in a bag. So the first option is the loose dry hopping, and that is simply that you shove everything in there and you wait. It's very simple. You just add the hops directly, and it does minimize the chances of you either having to worry about extra equipment being contaminated, having it on hand, cleaning it up, all these other hassles that go with it. But you do lose control, and you also have some issues with removing the hops at the end. To an extent, no matter what kind of hops you're using, some of it will break down and become circulating material, loose matter within your beer. By not being able to remove these without conditioning the beer, you risk running it into your keg or bottles. The easiest solution to this is a hop bag. Sometimes they're called a hop ball depending on what you're using, but the basic concept is exactly the same. You have your hops within a muslin bag or similar, and this goes straight in your fermenter. It's similar to a steel tea bag or a reusable tea bag. These are very simple and very effective for most people, and they do avoid most of the issues to do with the hops material that breaks free over time and getting into bottles and kegs. The downside to this is that they are a finite space, which means if you pack them too tightly, the rest of the beer can't get to the center of the hops mass very effectively, and so you do reduce the extraction of hop oils into your beer, and well, now you don't have the flavors that you're after, and you've just wasted whatever percentage you weren't able to use because the beer could not penetrate in. There's also issues with contamination if you're not exactly perfect with your cleaning and sanitizing. As we mentioned, when you're trying to do this, you were wanting to aim to try and add your hops somewhere around day 5 or halfway through the fermentation. Historically, homebrewers were adding it around day 7, and perhaps even as late as day 10, although that was getting towards the very far end, and as a result, you were losing some of the flavor. With craft brewing gaining popularity, along with greater discussion and dissemination of knowledge by homebrewers, that timeline has moved forward a bit, and so that's why we say somewhere around day 5, perhaps a little bit earlier, but certainly no more than day 3, which is very early. Anything less than that and you're going to just have lost most of the flavor. Anything more than day 10 and you're probably going to have the fermentation finished before you get much out of the hops. So you don't really want it in there for more than half of your fermentation time. So between 5 and maybe 6 days at the high end. When you are looking at adding hops to your beer, or at least the fermentation, you're going to have to vary quite a bit because different styles are going to have different requirements. But as a very broad rule, if you're looking at a typical ale, you're going to want 2 to 4 grams of hops for every liter. For a Indian Pale Ale, you're looking at 6 to 8 grams a litre, and this is again a throwback to that historical high hops content for shipping internationally. Your double International Pale Ale is about 8 to 10 grams, so it's only a slight increase. There is a final element to dry hopping that we should mention, and it's double hopping. This is, as the name suggests, when you add hops on 2 occasions, and the idea is simply to add twice as much of the hops flavour as you would otherwise have had. Generally speaking, you add it at your first initial date, which is somewhere around day 4 to 5, and then within a week you add a second batch of hops to this. If your fermentation is going to take between 10 and 14 days, this means your first batch of hops goes in somewhere between day 4 and 5, and your second batch of hops goes in around day 9 or 10. You do need to be careful when dry hopping, or at least double dry hopping at least, that if you leave the hops in there for more than 3 days at a time, you are going to begin to experience issues where you lose the bitter, refreshing hops flavour and start to extract much more of the plant matter flavour that's in there. And that's going to be a concern if you're trying to make a much more, let's say, refreshing beer rather than something that's quite earthy and, let's say, not necessarily desirable to everybody. This is why when you're double hopping, you should consider the use of something like a hops bag. This will help considerably in removing the hops after that initial period and then adding your second batch. It does, however, double the risk of contamination if you aren't careful. As you can see, dry hopping is not necessarily as straightforward as just adding hops. There is a certain complexity to the choice of hops that you're going to be adding, and you can, let's say, double up or increase the strength of the hops you're adding at a given time. Of course, this is not always necessary, but it can be helpful. It's up to you to decide on what you're after as far as the effects go. Do you want that strong, more punchy flavour, or are you happy with it to be slightly more subdued, but more balanced compared to everything else? Double hopping, or dry hopping as well, is simply a way to ensure you get more of the aroma and flavour and not just bitterness. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.